So now we're going to talk about functions. Now, functions are a way of letting you define certain things that you want to do over and over. So if you know that you have something that you're going to do a lot in a code, you can write a function for it. And then instead of having to write this piece of code over and over and over again, you can just call this function, and you can reduce a lot of lines of code down to just one line because all you have to do is call the function. But I'll just show you some examples of how they actually work. And so the way we start a function is by using the keyword def. Now you can see in my coding environment, def turns blue, so this indicates that it's a keyword, and it means I'm defining a function. And the structure of it is I write def first, and then I write the function name. So in this case, the function name would actually be function name, but we'll change this in a second. This is just to get the structure. After this, you're going to put brackets, so round brackets, and then inside you're going to put your input. And then you're going to put a colon, and then you're going to have an indent. And this indent indicates that it's inside the function. So everything that's indented will be part of this function. And then you're going to execute an action, or do several actions, and then you're going to return an output. And so this is generally how it looks. So let's just go through this again. You start off with the def keyword. This tells the computer that you're about to define a function. Then you give the function a name. So in this case, our function name is actually function name, and it appears in bold here. Then you put the brackets, and inside of the brackets you put input. And then you have a colon. This indicates that you want to start your function. And then you make a new line, and then you start indenting here. And so this is a tab, usually, that you use here. And then you write an action, and then you make a tab again, and then you return an output. And so if I were to continue writing here, for example like this, then this would all be part of the function. So this more code would be part of the function still, because it's indented. But if I now take it back and write more code here, then it's no longer a part of the function, because now we're on the same level and we're no longer indented into it. So now that we know the general structure, why don't we do something with it? So let's create our own little function. So I'm just going to leave this up here so that you can kind of remember everything, but I'm going to comment it out so that we don't actually have to deal with it. So let's create our first function together. We're going to call this function add1. Now we're going to put in a number. So we define the function with the def keyword, then we call the function add1, and you notice that my second word here is capital, and this is just to make the reading easier. So if I were to add another word here, say add1 2, then I would also make my 2 capital. And this is really just convention. It doesn't make a difference for the computer, but it's really just convention to kind of make reading your code easier and more understandable. So you don't have to do this, but it's just kind of a nice practice to do. So I'll take the 2 out again. So our function is called add1, and then we have the brackets behind it, and inside the brackets we have our input, and this input is called number. And this is just, it doesn't matter what it is, this is just any variable or even any object. So like it can be, it can be an integer, it can be strings, it can be floating point numbers, it can be other objects that we get to later, such as lists or classes, but it doesn't really matter. All you need to put here is just, this is just pretty much the name for your input so that you can call it later in your code. And if you remember last time when we talked about variables, this is only local, so it's not defined everywhere. It's only applicable within this function. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do number plus equals 1. So we're going to add one value to the number. So another way of writing this would, for example, be number equals number plus 1. So those are identical ways. And then we're going to return our number. So let's go through this piece of code. What do? Well, we define our function using the def keyword. We call our function add1, and so this kind of gives us an idea of what the function does, and it should add 1 to whatever the input is. Then we give a general name for the input, and then we have the colon. This indicates that we're going to start our function. Then on a new line, we indent to show that we are inside our function, and we have our number, which is this variable here, and we have it be equal to the current value of the number, so the input, plus 1. And then we're going to return the number. So all we're doing is just adding 1 to the number, and we're saving it in number again, and then we're returning it. We could also do it like this, for example. We could also create a new variable called output and have it be equal to number plus 1, in case this looks cleaner for you. So this does the same thing, but this is it's a cleaner way of writing it too. So it really depends on you, how you decide how you want to write your code. But we can just leave it like this for now too, so that it becomes really overseeable. So let's try to run our code a little bit. We're going to create a variable, and we're going to call this variable just var, and we're going to assign it the value 0. So what I've created here is a global variable, as you remember last time. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to store the value of var, or I'm going to overwrite my value of var rather, and I'm going to have it equal to add 1. And then what do I want to add 1 to? I want to add 1 to my value var. So I put in this here, and then it goes into the function. So this is how you call a function. Actually, let's give this a different name so that you don't get confused. So this syntax, this value does not have to go in here. So we can call this one, for example, var2, to show that this is our second variable. And so this is how we call the function. We write the function's name, then we write brackets behind it, and then we give in our input here. And so our input in this case is var, and var is assigned the value 0. So what we're effectively doing is we're putting 0 in here. But we're going to keep it as a variable because maybe we always want to do the same thing to var, but maybe the value of var will change later. So we'll just leave it like this in a more general version. And so what happens when I write this like this? Well, if I call my function and I give it the input var, then what happens when I write this is the function gets called. And so you can pretty much imagine this code gets copied on over here, kind of. So we'll just, when we call the function, we'll kind of go into it, and we see, okay, we do add 1 var. So now what we have is we go in here, we have add 1, and then we have our variable var here, the value of var. And then we have our output, and the output is equal to number, and number in this case is var, plus 1. And so the value of number in this case is 0. So our output is equal to 0 plus 1. And now, if you remember last time when we talked about local variables, the output is actually a local variable, and the number is also a local variable. So if we're inside a function, the only way that we can get information back out is through returning it. Otherwise, the information will just kind of be lost inside, because everything is only local. And as soon as you finish calling the function, everything inside just gets lost, or it gets deleted, it gets cleaned up. So to make sure that you actually get your result, you have to return back whatever it is that you want. So this is how you can do that. You just type in return output, and this gives back this number. And so what effectively happens to add 1 var is that our 0 gets placed in here, and then our output is equal to var plus 1, which is 0 plus 1, and then we return 0 plus 1, which is 1. And so what happens with the return is this value practically gets replaced by this value. So effectively, after this function is called, this value is equal to the value of output. Now, we can't actually write this because output is only defined locally within this function, and it doesn't exist outside of this function. But this is just to kind of give you an idea of what we actually get. So we'll just call our function again like we did before. But it's important to know that the value of var2 is going to be the value that was returned from this function. And so just to see that we actually get the result, or to visualize the result, we'll call our print function again, and we're going to print var2. And we can even print var before, just to make sure that it's actually 0. So let's just see what happens here. So we run our file, and we print var, which is 0. Then we create variable 2, or var2 rather, as it's called, and then we give the value of var2, the value that is returned from calling var in this function, add1. And so if we call var in this function, we get 0 plus 1, so 1 is returned, so the value of var2 is 1. And we print this value here. And so we see that the value that we get is actually 1. Now, if we call this again, for example, if we say var3 is equal to add1 of var2, so if we make a third variable and we call the add1 function on variable 2, then we'll go through the same process and we go into the add1 function, and number effectively gets replaced by var2, and var2 has the value 1 from up here, as we just went through before. So if we go down here, we have output is equal to var2, and the value of var2 is 1, so we have 1 plus 1, so our output is equal to 1 plus 1, which is 2, and then we return 2, and so this whole function gives us back the number 2, and so our var3 should be equal to 2. So let's test this out. Oh, we have to print this first to make sure that we actually see the value of var3, because right now all we're doing is creating it, but we can't actually see it until we print it. So it does happen, it does do exactly what we want it to do. We get our 0 from our var, we get our 1 from our var2, which is add1 of var, so add 1 on 0, and then we get our 2 from var3, which is add 1 on 1. Now, what we can also do is, instead of using variables, I'll just show you this, we can also just put in numbers instead. So we can do add 1 on, let's say, 2, instead of calling var3 in here. And then let's just print the value of var4. And so what I'm doing here is I'm calling the function add1, and I'm calling it with a number this time rather than with a variable, but it doesn't really make a difference because a variable is also just kind of a placeholder for a value. It's just that it's a more general placeholder, or it's generally a placeholder, and so it can contain any value, whereas this one can only be the number 2 now, because I've defined, or I've hard-coded in 2 because I've written in 2, and we can't really change the value of 2. So this gives us a little bit of flexibility. But just to show you what's possible, we'll just use the number 2. And so the value of var4 is assigned to be the value that's returned when I call the function add1 and give it the input 2. So if we go into our function add1 with input 2, then we have output is equal to the input, which is 2, plus 1. And so we return 2 plus 1, so we return 3. So let's call this and see what happens. So we get our 0 from our var, we get our 1 from our var2, we get our 2 from our var3 here, and we get our 3 from our var4 here. So yeah, so now we can kind of see. But we don't only have to put in integers. We can, for example, put in floats or decimals. So let's try doing 2.1. Now, all we did was replace 2 by 2.1, and the reason this is going to work is because this is just a general variable, so this can really be anything, and we don't really tell, we don't really tell it what it is. We don't say this has to be an integer, this has to be a decimal, this has to be a string. In Python, we don't do that. In Python, we just say we're going to get input, and this input we're going to save in a local variable called number, and Python kind of expects the programmer to know what the input is going to be, or what the input can't be, to avoid errors. So that's when you get in later, you have to kind of code it in such a way that you prevent people from putting in the wrong input, so that they, for example, don't put in strings or something. But we'll go through all that, so don't really worry about it. The important thing to know right now is that this really isn't limited by anything. This can be pretty much anything. And so that's why this is going to work. So we can just put in 2.1 here too, and it will just work. It would work all the same. And luckily 2.1 is also a number, and we can add 1 to it. And so everything's going to be okay. The computer knows how to add 2.1 and 1, so it's not going to complain. So let's run this. And as you see, we get our 0 from our var here, which is expected, our 1 from our var 2, which is add 1 of 0, our 2 from our var 3, which is add 1 of 1, or add 1 of the value of var 2, and the value of var 2 is 1 from here. And then we get our 3.1 from var 4, which is the add 1 on 2.1. Now, let's try something spooky in here. Let's try 2.1 plus 3.4. And so what we're doing here is we're kind of giving a sum input, but we're only giving one input. So this is going to be calculated first, and it's going to come out to 5.5, and then our number is going to be replaced by 5.5. So this is going to work too, because it's going to be calculated first, and then it's going to be inputted as one number. So this would work too. Let's just see it in action. So again, our 0 from var, which is 0, our 1 from var 2, which is the add 1 function on 0, so add 1 on 0, which is 1, our 2, which is the add 1 function on 1, so add 1 on 1, which is 2, and then we get our 6.5, which is the add 1 function on 2.1 plus 3.4. But if we calculate this out, 2.1 plus 3.4, 2 plus 3 is 5, 1 plus 4 is 5, so if we add 1 to 5.5, we'll get out 6.5. So this works too. Well, this is really great. So this really gives us a lot of flexibility about how we can input data into a function. So this is just kind of some of the different ways, as you can see. Now, what if I want to input more than one number, for example? So let's create a new function. And let's create this function def add 1 and add 2. So we'll write this first, and then you'll understand the name. So the goal of the function is that we get in two variables, so we can input two values, and we add 1 to the first one, and we add 2 to the second one. So let's see how that goes. So our first input is going to be number, and we'll just call this number 1 just to kind of be distinct. And then to indicate that we want a second input, we're going to put a comma. And then we're going to put in our second input, and we're going to call this one number 2. Now, if we wanted to put in more input, we would just separate it by a comma again, and then we can put in input 3. And if we want even more input, we can put another comma and go input 4. But we'll just stick with 2 inputs now. But this is just kind of to give you the idea of how you can have more than one input, more than 2 input, as many inputs as you like. You just have to separate them by commas. That's it. And make sure that you don't finish with a comma in the end. That's important. But now, let's just stick with 2 inputs. We'll stick with input number 1, and then with input number 2. And we indicate that these are 2 different inputs because they're separated by a comma. And so let's indicate that we want to start our function by doing the colon. So we have our keyword def. We have our function, which is add 1 and add 2. And then we have our input, which is number 1, and our second input, which is number 2. So let's go and make our output. And our output is going to be number 1 plus 1. And now let's also add to our output number 2 plus 2. And so you may remember from above, or also from before, that output plus equals is the same as writing is equal to output plus. So to just kind of go with a different notation here, we'll just go with plus equals, but I can write the other version up here just to so that you can compare and really see what's going on. So I'll comment this out so that the code doesn't run it, so that the function doesn't run it. But as you can see here, the output plus equals is the same as writing output equals, and then the variable again, and then plus. So all we're doing right now is just adding something to this output variable. And what we're going to add to it is number 2 plus 2. So we're going to take our second input, we're going to add 2 to it, and then we're going to add that to output. So again, this is the same as this up here, so I'll write this in here too. This is the same as adding number 2 plus 2. So this is some pretty complicated code right here. So let's just go through this one more time just to really understand what's going on. So we define our function, we call it add1, add2. We have our input 1, which we're going to call number 1, and we have our input 2, which we're going to call number 2. And then we say that we want to start a function by putting on the colon. And then we go into the function, and we have our indent here to indicate that we're inside the function. And then we declare our local variable output, and we give the value output, the value of number 1, or of the first input, plus 1. And then we add to this value that we created up here, we add to it number 2 plus 2. So we add to it the second input, the value of the second input, plus 2. And now this is the same as this. And as you can see, just by what I did here, you can also add comments inside the function, and it's still going to work smoothly, as long as you are all within this indented space. But if I were to, go unindented here, then this would now no longer be inside the function because it's no longer indented. And it's also important that all the indentation here is the same, so that you're all on one line, or else Python's going to complain about this too, because now this is kind of a subpart of that, but that doesn't really make any sense. So you want to make sure that you give it the same indentation, which is just commonly just a tab, and then everything inside here, inside this indentation, is going to be part of this function. So let's return our output. Okay, so now we're just kind of giving back the value of output. So this is that we can kind of access it outside of this function. And then let's try to use this function. So let's create, for example, let's create the variable sum. And let's call it, or let's have it be the value of calling add1, add2. And I want to make sure I spelled this name correctly, or else it's not going to work. And now my coding environment is really nice. And if I just have my cursor here, it's actually going to highlight this and highlight everything with the same name. So this gives me a really nice oversight. But you just want to make sure that the name is the same. I mean, a trick that you could also do is just highlight this here, copy it, and then put it over here, and then paste it in. So this really ensures that the function name is the same. Because if I, for example, had my 2 lowercase, this is not the same, and so it wouldn't know what to do. So we really want to make sure the writing here is the same. So we have add1, add2, and we're going to give it the inputs 1 and 2 for now. And then we're going to print the value of sum. So before we run this code, let's go through it first and see what happens. So we have our number 1, which is, or our input 1, which is the value of, or which is number 1. And we have our input 2, which is called number 2, which is the number 2. And so we define our output variable, which is only defined in here. And we have it be equal to the value of number 1, which is 1. So we have it be 1 plus 1, so 2. And then we add to it 2, because our input 2 is 2. So we add to it 2 plus 2. So we add to it 4. So we have 2, and then we add 4 to 2. So we get output is equal to 6. So if we go through this more reviewable one, we see output is equal to 1 plus 1. And now we define our output is equal to 2, so 1 plus 1. So 2 plus input 2, which is 2, plus 2. So we have output is equal to 2 plus 2 plus 2. And then we're going to return it. So we're going to return 6, and then we're going to see 6 printed here. So let's run this. And now here we still get all the input from before, so the 0, 1, 2, and 6.5 that we all have up here. And then we get our value 6, which is the value of calling this function. Now, I can also just call it with variables again. So I can also, for example, just do var2 and var3, which I've defined up here, which have the values add 1 on 0. So var2 has the value 1, and this one has the value add 1 on var2, and var2 has the value 1 because of this. So we have var3 is equal to add 1 on 1, so 2. So this is pretty much the same. This is going to give us the same output as it did before. But now we're not calling it with numbers, we're calling it with variables. So we get 6 again. And so this is really kind of the basics of functions. And now you can obviously get a lot more complicated. But this is just really to give you an idea about the general structure. And functions are going to be really, really useful throughout all of your programming. I mean, you're going to write a lot of functions and you're going to be dealing with functions the whole time because they really allow you to simplify code. And I don't have to write, right here I'd be writing 2 lines of code, which isn't that bad. But imagine this is 10 or 20, so it's really going to save you a lot of time. And all you have to do, and a lot of space too, and all you have to do is just call the function name and put in the input, and then you get this value returned. So it's a really nice way, especially if you want to do the same thing over and over again. So functions are going to be really useful, and we're going to be dealing with them a lot. And you'll definitely get used to them, so don't worry about that.